Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, in the time of the everything bubble, anything can bring about a crash. We know back in 2008, banks were ready to completely collapse within the scope of 3 days, and money markets were being frozen across the world. So, with this being said, one area that very few are focusing on or even talking about is the very real threat of the stablecoin sector taking down the entire financial system.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something we kind of thought about talking for a while, and we finally decided it would probably be a good subject because it isn't getting a lot of attention. I think this obviously also relates to this Genius Act, which, from my perspective, and I'm sure Ken agrees, is anything but a Genius Act. And we're going to explain why we believe this is fraught with dangers, fraught with risk, and why it's extremely ill-advised to put such a measure in place. I think it very clearly demonstrates an absolute act of desperation. I know some people will say to the contrary, but for me, it's a very clear indication no one in the world, or very few in the world anymore, want to buy US Treasuries. Certainly, we know for over a decade now, foreigners have not been buying US Treasuries, basically. And this is an act of desperation to try and reignite the US Treasury, US dollar complex. And to all intents and purposes, it's such an act of desperation. And it begs the question, frankly, if you wanted to buy US Treasuries, you would just go and buy US Treasuries. I mean, why would you, for example, obviously, effectively give a stablecoin issuer a dollar, and then obviously you get a stablecoin which has no it bears no interest payment on it, and then they, in principle, have to go and correspondingly buy a US Treasury. So, in fact, they get the benefit of the interest that accrues on that, buying that treasury, and you get nothing. But what do you do with the stable coin on that basis? I mean, you're going to go and invest it in something? I mean, there's another question that's not very clear. But if you want to buy US treasuries, just go and buy them. And if you don't, then why are you going to bother with stablecoin? Because that's the basis of saying to someone, well, instead of holding a dollar, which is equals one stable coin, you can buy stable coins. Well, so what? I mean, and frankly, it just seems to me to be rather a ridiculous idea, full stop. The other question it raises then is, what is the risk? And we'll come on to that, to the institutions issuing them. That's another big problem. Also, it raises the question, well, this is supposed to be a replacement for a central bank digital currency, which obviously would be issued and regulated, etc., by the Fed. So this is clearly an attempt by the Trump administration to bypass the Fed. We're not saying that's wrong. We're just stating that as a matter of fact. So, as an initial assessment, there are so many potential flaws in doing this. And then I'm going to come on to shortly after Ken's introduction, which assesses who can be a permitted stablecoin issuer and the problems associated with that, and the vague nature of what those categories are should be very worrying. And a point worth making is that, in principle, at least up to a certain figure, you can go and put your money in a bank and it will be insured because it's an insured depository institution. Now, very different, it varies in different countries, but in principle, you could open a bank account and put the limit in one if you were lucky to have that much money, and go and open another bank account and put the limit in that. Where if you go and put your money into stablecoin, in this example, you have no protection whatsoever. So why would you want to take the risk on that basis? Well, the logic is you absolutely wouldn't want to do so.
Yeah, there's an analyst who spoke in an interview over the weekend, and he pretty much laid this out. He said uh, the stablecoin market is basically unregulated due to the Genius Act. Hold on a second. Frog in my throat there. And most of the companies participating haven't even passed an audit. Stablecoin sponsors are almost completely unregulated, non-transparent. No one has ever audited them. We don't know what's inside. And they went on to note in 2008, the money market funds froze and the Fed bailed them out. But the Fed is the Fed going to bail out the stablecoin market? Definitely not. Because as you pointed out, it looks like, especially from the Trump administration, who has decided to go full bore into this, where in the past decade, Congress has been against it, led by Elizabeth Warren. They've been pushing anti cryptocurrencies. And now all of a sudden, with the Trump administration, it's full on stablecoin to the hilt. There's a lot of moving parts in this. But another thing to take into consideration, too, is go back to what Warren Buffett once said. He said that the derivatives are the, WMD of the financial world. In just the going back to when Bitcoin came 2009, about that time, so we're talking 16 years. In just that time, the stablecoin market alone, not counting the standard cryptocurrency, just the stablecoin market, is now in the trillions. And because it is inside Wall Street, it has a derivatives market of over $50 trillion in just that short amount of time.
Yeah. So yeah, and you can see if you have a contagion problem, it's going to spread and likely would blow up the financial system rather easily. And the other thing regarding the point of this not being issued via the Fed, well, the Fed can, in a very retaliatory way and quite justified, would say, "Well, we're not going to bail this out. It's nothing to do with us. You decided to go your own way, so you deal with the problem." And they're not going to be able to deal with the problem. So then what happens? And I suppose the argument is, well, if a whole bunch of financial institutions start blowing up, then the Fed will be forced to step in because if they don't, then it risks taking down the entire financial system. And of course, that is not going to be allowed to happen. And maybe that's the point with this. They're sat there going, well, if the worst comes to the worst, don't worry, the Fed will step in and resolve the problem. Another issue with this is when they talk about these permitted payment stablecoin issuers. And there's obviously a bunch of categories. And it says is a person formed in the US that is a subsidiary of an insured depository institution and that has been approved to issue stable coins. And then it includes a federal qualified payment stablecoin issuer or a state qualified payment stablecoin issuer. Now, why am I mentioning this? Well, I mention it because these categories are extremely important because it says a subsidiary of an insured depository institution can issue payment stablecoins after receiving approval from the insured depositories institution's appropriate federal banking agency. Well, that's all well and good, but these aren't insured. So what's the point in doing that for starters? And what is a subsidiary of this? I mean, that's a rather tenuous statement. And then it gets even more tenuous because it talks about a federal qualified payment stablecoin issue. It can be a non-bank entity. What does that mean? I mean, that's as vague as it can get. An uninsured national bank or a federal branch of a foreign bank. So hang on, what does that mean? I mean, and of course, it has to be approved by the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, how many applications are going to be turned down? If you say a non-bank entity, well, does that mean big corporations can issue them? So it's not, then it's non-banks. So all of a sudden, we effectively would have non-banks issuing stablecoins. What's the limit on this? And are they then going to go and be on the hook for enormous amounts of US treasuries as a result of this? And what happens if there's a big, sudden, sharp turn in the Treasury markets, and you end up with situations where suddenly an institution is notionally underwater? What happens if there's a lack of confidence in holding a stablecoin? There's a run on people trying to dump them because suddenly the stablecoin isn't worth $1. Maybe it's worth 98 cents. Maybe it's worse, and then everyone's trying to bail out. Then what does that do to the Treasury markets? And is that really going to be a situation where the drawbridge gets pulled up and people are told, sorry, you can't sell your stable coin. Tell you, sorry, not possible. It's entirely possible that could happen. And then it talks about a stable qualified payment stablecoin issuer. That's an entity established under the laws of a state that has been approved by a state payment stablecoin regulator to issue payment stablecoins. And it said is not an uninsured national bank, a federal branch, an insured depository institution, or a subsidiary of any of the aforementioned. I mean, then you're really getting into a grey area as to what these institutions are. So if it's not properly regulated, in the end, it would just allow whoever to issue stable coins. And then the question in that regard is what exactly is the point of them doing this? Because if you give them $1 and then they give you a stable coin, which is pretty useless to you, then you hold it, and then it means all these institutions, non-banking institutions, who knows, in an unregulated market, are supposed to, in principle, hold enormous amounts of US treasuries. So it's to stimulate basically a pseudo market for US treasuries because no one else will buy them. But the question is, if they're not regulated, can you really ultimately trust that every institution who's taking part in this is bona fide? I'm not saying the vast majority wouldn't be. We're not saying that in any way, shape, or form. But if there was a problem, then that can set off a contagion problem and wreak havoc in the entire financial system. And it could be, for argument's sake, and I'm not going to mention names because then the implication is that institution could be the thing that that basically unravels it all. But it could be a non-bank entity who basically takes down the financial system because of all the factors we've just said coming into play. That's why this is a really serious problem in the making. Now, and ultimately, of course, the question is this really going to increase demand for US treasuries? Because the question I'd like to ask anyone in the Trump administration is, who wants to hold stablecoins? Who actually wants to hold them? For what purpose? Why? Because then they're going to go and start gambling in the crypto sector. Well, they can go and do that already. Why would they want to buy stable coins from these institutions? Well, someone will say, well, because they're a lot more reliable and safe than the existing stablecoin market. Well, really? Are they? They could be anything but that. They could be a lot less stable than the existing so-called stablecoin market. And the fact you call it a stablecoin just demonstrates the absurdity of this, because we're highlighting why, in principle, they could be anything but stablecoins.
Yeah, when you take a look at it, and this is one thing I want to definitely emphasize, because I know we have a lot of listeners who are big Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency advocates. There is a massive difference between a stable coin and the standard cryptocurrency. If you wanted to buy Ethereum, Bitcoin, whatever, Dogecoin as a speculative investment, hoping to get a return on it, even if you for what the original Satoshi idea was that it would become a pseudo replacement in the gray market or the black market for uh, transactions and bartering between people. That's absolutely fine. But we're talking about stable coins that are unregulated in the uh, total concept. But what they do is if you buy a stable coin, you are limited on what you can do with it. You're almost, for all intents and purposes, buying either government assets such as treasuries, or you're buying this small little basket of what Wall Street wants you to do. Here, you can take your stable coin and you can invest in an ETF. Oh, by the way, our ETF will let you buy Bitcoin, but you'll never receive the Bitcoin the same way that GLD and SLV is. You're buying gold, you're buying silver, but really you're just buying paper. That's the whole thing about it. And one of the things I don't have the complete paper, or trail audit here or paper trail. But isn't it interesting that the rise of stablecoin purchases and the derivatives markets by Wall Street and the banks have almost gone coinciding with the decline of the banks using the reverse repo market?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one final point I've got with regards to this is you then start to dig into, and I've left this on purpose to make a point, is when it talks about the Stablecoin Certification Review Committee. And what that's supposed to do is ensuring companies don't pose a material risk to the soundness of the US banking system, the financial stability of the US, apparently the deposit insurance fund, etc., etc. Well, when you start to dig down as to who's on the committee, there's the Secretary of the Treasury, there's the chair of the FDIC, so the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, nothing out of the ordinary there. But you also find the chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. So, hang on a minute. This has got nothing to do with the Federal Reserve. It's not a CBDC, so why does it include the chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve? Why are they on the Stablecoins Certification Review Committee? That's a bit strange. So there is some tie to the Federal Reserve. One might also argue that whilst the Trump administration's not dealing with CBDCs, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes in financial institutions that are actually continuing to work on this. So the obvious argument is Trump's not going to be around in 3+ years. So what happens after that? So for me, this is a very woolly area, very grey. It's not clear who can issue them. There are serious risks, and we've highlighted at a very high level, but they exemplify why this is an act of desperation to try and stimulate demand for US treasuries. But it comes back to the point, who wants to hold a stable coin and why? Oh, because it's a dollar. Well, yeah, but if someone, for argument's sake, wants to buy $1 million of US treasuries, well, why don't they just buy $1 million of US treasuries and benefit from the yield on those treasuries? Okay, forget all the intended risk or potential risk, but why would you go and buy $1 million of stable coin when you don't get any interest? It's not interest bearing at all. In which case, what's the point in issuing this stable coin issue? What's the point of the Genius Act? And because if there's all these institutions queuing up to indirectly put their money in for no benefit to them to buy US treasuries, why don't they just buy them themselves?
Well, exactly. And especially as the world has been moving, the rest of the world has been moving into buying gold and silver, whether it's central banks, the opaque market, especially Asia. What has the U.S. been desperately trying to do? They've been trying to desperately get the pension funds, the money market, or the money managers, hedge funds, and that to not invest in gold and silver as a transfer. Instead, keep buying treasuries, keep the system going, keep the derivatives going to ensure that it doesn't collapse and crash like it did in 2008. And I think that's one of the other important things about this stablecoin and its whole proliferate is that it's an opportunity that Wall Street did not have. Wall Street can't go out to say Coinbase or CoinDesk and buy cryptocurrency directly from that. They've been cut off from that. But pension funds can go to these ETF desks and buy stable coins and then thus have access to all these other things, these different cryptocurrencies, these derivatives, these treasuries, the whole nine yards. And well, just like when we saw in 2008, who knows how big this market is? And there's trillions of dollars that are sitting there not being used that especially in this debt-ridden economy and financial system that the U.S. government's in, if they're not getting capital from the rest of the world, they've got to get capital from somewhere. Either that, or in many different ways, printing it digitally out of thin air.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good point to finish on.
Absolutely. Thanks as always, Paul, for your insight and for being a part of the discussion.
Yeah, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.